Some men disappear not because they're forgotten, but because no one bothered to ask who they were. What really happened when an old man sat in a seat meant for someone important? Let us know in the comments section below, and subscribe for more true stories of courage, justice, and legacy. They told Simon McHale to move. That's how it began. A firm tap on his shoulder, not aggressive, but firm. A young woman in her late 20s, dressed in the blue and gray of the event staff, leaned down and spoke in a voice meant to sound polite but carried the clipped edge of urgency. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this row is reserved for our VIP guests. Could I help you find a seat in the general section?" Simon turned his head slowly, the movement precise, as if it had been trained by decades of discipline. His pale blue eyes met hers, clear and calm despite the lines that ran across his face like maps of forgotten campaigns. He didn't speak at first. His gaze dropped to the gold-trimmed card on the seat beside him. Reserved. MCH, uppercase, bold, deliberate. He lifted the card slightly and held it up between two fingers. The young woman blinked. She reached down, adjusted her badge, and leaned forward again, reading it more closely this time. "Oh," she said, cheeks coloring. I'm sorry, sir, I must have missed that one." Simon gave a nod so slight it might have been mistaken for nothing at all. He set the card back down, adjusted the crease of his slacks, and resumed watching the unfolding crowd. Cadets, parents, alumni, reporters. But the damage had already been done. A few rows behind him, someone chuckled. "He probably picked it up off a table. You know how these guys get," said a balding man in a tailored Navy suit. That was Todd Mercer, class of '89, former quarterback, current CEO of a real estate development firm, and the kind of man who never remembered the janitor's name, but always remembered which fork to use. Todd didn't whisper. He never whispered. The woman who had approached Simon didn't correct him. She stood still, hovering awkwardly before finally slipping off toward the other side of the lawn where more guests were arriving. Don's comment settled like dust. Simon remained still. The truth was, Simon McHale hadn't returned to Oakridge in nearly 30 years. The last time he'd stepped foot on the brick courtyard was when his son, his only son, graduated from the Institute. That was a lifetime ago, long before the Parkinsons, before the quiet house, before the pictures began to outnumber the people who called. He had received the invitation 3 months prior, thick parchment, gold seal, his name printed cleanly above the line. Founding contributor and distinguished veteran educator. There were no speeches planned in his name, no award waiting, but they'd reserved a seat, one seat, VIP. That was enough. He had ironed his only suit the night before the flight. Shoes shined until he could see the ceiling in their reflection. He brought nothing but a single photograph in his inner breast pocket. Oakridge, 1973. Cadets running through the very first field leadership exercise, a course he had designed when the academy was still in its infancy. Before the marble buildings, before the bronze statues, back when the mud told more stories than the walls ever would. Now the courtyard was filled with clean dress blues and tailored blazers. Camera crews jockeyed for position. Cadets stood at attention, lining the edges like sentinels. And in the middle of it all, Simon McHale sat in the front row, silent and immovable. But to most, he was invisible. It wasn't just the staffer who overlooked his name. 3 alumni leaned over to shake hands around him, smiling with recognition at each other, but passing over Simon like he was a misplaced decoration. A professor pointed out key figures in attendance to a visiting dignitary, gesturing directly past Simon to the row behind him. And still, he didn't flinch. He sat with his back straight and his hands folded loosely in his lap. Only once did he look down at the white program in his lap. His name wasn't listed on the back with the other honorees. The print was small, but he checked twice anyway. On the far side of the assembly lawn, Headmaster Everett Langston stood beneath the stage canopy, reviewing his notes. He glanced at his watch. Exactly 4 minutes to ceremony start. "Have we confirmed seating for all the VIPs?" he asked. "Everyone's accounted for except one," replied Melissa Pratt, the same staffer who had approached Simon. "We're just waiting on a General McHale, I think." Langston's head snapped up. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice sharp and immediate. Melissa flipped her clipboard, scanning. "Simon McHale. He's on the list. Section A, Row 1, Seat 3. Langston didn't reply. Instead, he turned on his heel and began walking briskly toward the front row. 3 decades earlier, he had been Cadet Langston, third-year plebe, struggling through the mud of that very first tactics course. The one McHale built. The one that turned boys into leaders and leaders into men. Langston hadn't forgotten, not a damned thing. And as he neared row 1, something shifted in the air, just enough that even Todd Mercer, halfway through a laugh, paused mid-sentence to watch. The headmaster wasn't smiling, but Simon still hadn't seen him. He was adjusting the crease of his cuff now, as if it were the most important thing in the world. Langston approached. He stopped. He looked down at the old man in the chair. And finally, Simon looked up. The hesitation in Simon's eyes was brief. Recognition wasn't instant. Langston had filled out, his once thin frame now squared with age and authority, and his salt-and-pepper hair was cut tight in Navy style. But when the headmaster took off his cover, knelt slightly, just enough to be eye-level, and said softly, "Master Sergeant McHale." Master Simon knew. His mouth didn't smile, but his eyes did. "Cadet Langston," he replied, voice worn but steady. "Didn't expect you to make Admiral?" Langston allowed himself the faintest chuckle. "Didn't expect to survive basic thanks to your obstacle course." That earned a slight nod from Simon, a small glimmer in his gaze. But around them, the tension was building. Parents squinted, watching the exchange. The murmuring behind Simon quieted. Even Todd Mercer leaned forward, curiosity twisting his lips into something confused and vaguely suspicious. Langston didn't bother with a microphone. His voice didn't need it. "I want to personally thank you for being here, Sergeant," he said, loud enough for the row behind them to hear. "You built the very bones of Oakridge. Half these cadets don't know that everything they've learned traces back to you." Simon blinked slowly, still silent. "You were on that VIP list for a reason. Not because of money, not because of connections. Because legacy," Langston continued. "And I'd be ashamed if anyone here failed to recognize that." He straightened, replacing his cap. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the crowd that had been watching. Melissa, the staffer, stood rooted to the spot, one hand covering her clipboard like a shield. "Ladies and gentlemen," Langston said, his voice now taking on its professional cadence, "before this ceremony begins, I'd like to take a moment to introduce someone who doesn't need a spotlight, though he's earned every bit of one." He extended his hand toward Simon. "This is Master Sergeant Simon McHale, United States Army, retired. He's the original architect of Oakridge's ground tactics program, designed during the Academy's first transformation into a leadership training institute. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in Korea. Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Cross, 40 years of public school teaching after active duty, and today, on our 50th anniversary, he chose to spend it with us." There was silence, a long, heavy silence. To the man calling himself Nantucket. He stopped clapping, except the weird sound got stronger. Not thunderous at first, a few parents in the middle rows, an older woman up front wiping her eyes as she rose to her feet, then the cadets, one by one, like dominoes. Every single one of them came to attention and began to applaud, not the clumsy kind, not the polite kind, the kind of clapping meant to shake guilt from walls. Todd Mercer's hands were still. He sat stiffly, looking around, trying to determine how this had escaped him. Langston didn't stop. "And if anyone here questioned whether he belonged in the VIP section, Allow me to be perfectly clear. He belongs in every seat of honor we could ever offer. And we don't have enough of them for men like him. More applause. Simon didn't stand. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't need to. He simply placed his hands on his knees, looked out at the sea of cadets, and gave a slight, respectful nod. Langston leaned down one more time and said with a whisper, "Don't worry, I've got something planned. You won't be invisible again." Simon shook his head gently. "Wasn't invisible, just quiet." Langston smiled. "Not anymore." He returned to the stage as the applause finally began to die down. Simon reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph. The edges were worn soft like cloth. He unfolded it gently, holding it in both hands. The image was black and white, blurred at the corners from age. A dozen young cadets mid-run, mud on their uniforms, fire in their eyes. One of them, with an expression of disbelief and joy, had his arm slung over another's shoulder, and in the background, barely visible, stood Simon, younger, sharper. Eyes just the same. "Sir?" A quiet voice. Simon looked up. A young man, no more than 17, stood at attention in the aisle wearing cadet grays. His name tag read, Ramirez. There was hesitation in the boy's eyes, like he wasn't sure if he should even speak. "I just wanted to say," he paused, then cleared his throat. "Thank you." "Master Sergeant?" Simon raised a brow. "For what?" "For this place, the course." "I didn't know it was you. I thought it was named after someone else." Simon looked amused. "They call it the Legacy Course now?" Ramirez nodded. Simon folded the photograph again, tucking it gently back into his breast pocket. "Should," he said. "Legacy's not about your name being remembered. It's about whether you taught somebody to walk when they couldn't stand." Ramirez blinked. Then he snapped a crisp salute. Simon returned it with slow precision. The boy laughed. The crowd began to settle. The stage filled with uniformed speakers, the national anthem played, and rows of dignitaries took their seats as if nothing unusual had happened. But the air had shifted. Something reverent had entered it, something old and enduring. And as the colors were presented and the first speech began, no one dared ask Simon to move again. Not even Todd Mercer. Especially not Todd Mercer. The speeches rolled on. Admirals and alumni recounted the evolution of Oakridge Military Institute, how it had grown from a dusty leadership program into one of the nation's most respected academies. Each speaker stood behind polished wood, their voices echoing over carefully arranged rows. And while they listed donors and reforms, battles and budgets, one name remained conspicuously absent: Simon McHale. Simon didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. He sat still, his back straight, his hands folded quietly in his lap. The photograph never came back out. It had already done its job. Across the aisle, Todd Mercer was watching him. He hadn't applauded, not fully, maybe 2 claps, the kind a man gives when he knows everyone's watching. But now, hours into the event, Todd wasn't watching the stage. His eyes were on Simon, measuring him. Todd had built his entire reputation on knowing who mattered in a room. At first, Simon had seemed like nothing, a forgotten relic, a well-dressed ghost in the wrong seat. But now the entire tone of the event had shifted. Langston had given him a quiet spotlight. The cadets had honored him without being told. Even a few reporters had lingered by his row, scribbling notes with sudden interest. Todd leaned toward the man beside him, a bloated alumnus with gold cufflinks and a reputation built on donations. "Who is he, really?" Todd asked under his breath. The man squinted. "McHale? I remember the name. Legacy course guy. Vietnam, I think. Taught at public schools forever. Never took a dime from the academy. Practically vanished." "Not quite," Todd muttered. His jaw tightened. There was a moment, a fleeting one, when something like shame passed across his face. But Todd Mercer didn't believe in shame. Not really. Just miscalculations. And he hated miscalculating. At the reception following the ceremony, folding tables lined the perimeter of the Oakridge quad. Cadets laughed with families and faculty gave carefully curated tours of the updated facilities. A brass band played softly from the rotunda. Simon stood alone near the edge of the crowd, watching the cadets move through the space he'd once helped design. He said little, smiled occasionally. His presence was enough. But not everyone was content with that. A group of 3 young men in suits stood by the refreshments. They were alumni, mid-30s, polished and loud enough to be heard. One of them sipped from a plastic cup and said, "So, that old guy is the one who built the obstacle course? That's it?" Another laughed. "Yeah, my dad said the guy was obsessed with discipline. Probably ran classrooms like a boot camp. I thought he was the janitor when I first walked in." The laughter wasn't cruel exactly, but it was careless, the way people talk when they think no one important is listening. But someone was. Cadet Ramirez, still in full dress uniform, stood a few feet away. He had heard every word, and without pause he stepped forward, straightened, and addressed them with the calm, clipped tone of someone used to standing up taller than he felt. "Gentlemen, that man over there spent 40 years teaching leadership to kids whose parents couldn't afford Oakridge. He designed the foundation of everything this place is built on. You ever drag yourself through Legacy Hill at 5 in the morning? You ever make it to the top without throwing up or blacking out? Then you owe him something." The laughter stopped. The tallest of the 3 looked away. Ramirez held his stare for a moment, then turned and walked back toward Simon. When he reached him, he said simply, "Sir, would you like a coffee?" Simon looked at him. "I think I'd like that." They walked together, the cadet matching Simon's slower pace without a hint of impatience. Across the quad Langston watched. His arms were crossed, his mouth unreadable. Beside him stood a woman in a blue scarf and dark sunglasses. "You see that?" Langston asked. She nodded. "You were right to bring him back." "Not just bring him back," Langston said. "Let them see him. Let them really see what this place was before it had donors and statues." The woman, whose name was Evelyn Reed, a journalist covering the event, lowered her glasses. "Do you think they're ready to hear that story?" she asked. Langston didn't look away from Simon. "I think it's the only one worth telling." By now, more cadets had noticed. A few approached Simon hesitantly, offering handshakes or respectful nods. One asked him to autograph a program. He refused at first, but the cadet insisted. So he signed, careful and slow, the pen wobbling once from his trembling hand. Behind them, Todd Mercer approached Langston. "Nice turnout," Todd said, sipping his sparkling water. "Thought I recognized a few senators." Langston nodded but said nothing. "You handled that thing with the old vet pretty well," Todd continued. "Almost missed the name myself." Langston turned. "Did you?" Todd hesitated. "You know how it is. Long day, a lot of faces." Langston smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think it was a short day, Todd. And one face that really mattered." Todd's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Langston leaned closer. "You want to be remembered here? Write a check? Build a building? You want to matter here? Be a McHale." Todd didn't respond. He just took another sip and walked away. And across the courtyard, in the warmth of late afternoon sun, Simon McHale sat beneath a stone pillar engraved with names, none of which were his. But the cadets gathered near him like they'd found something better than a plaque. The sun dipped lower now, drawing shadows across the academy lawn, but the glow on the faces around Simon McHale only grew warmer. Where once he had sat alone, now he was surrounded. Cadets in uniform flanked him in an imperfect semicircle, at ease but alert. A few parents hovered nearby, some discreetly taking photos, unsure of who he was, but sensing the weight of his presence. Simon didn't move much. He didn't have to. The reverence around him did all the talking. Langston stood at the edge of the rotunda, flipping the final page of his speech notes with one hand, his eyes on the gathering. It was unscripted, what was happening now, and that was precisely why it mattered. "I'd like to say a few closing words," Langston announced, stepping back onto the podium and signaling the brass band to lower their instruments. The murmurs across the lawn hushed. "I planned on ending today with a thank you to our board, our donors, and our distinguished alumni, but something happened during this event that made me realize none of those acknowledgments would be complete without one more name." He paused. The crowd leaned in. 50 years ago, when Oakridge was transitioning from a regional program to a national institution, there was one man who laid the foundation for the leadership curriculum we use to this day. He didn't take credit. He didn't cash checks. But he trained every cadet who walked this campus in those early years, sometimes with nothing more than a compass, a chalkboard, and a stack of paper targets. Langston pointed. "Master Sergeant Simon McHale." A spotlight clicked on, brighter than the sun now retreating behind the buildings. It found Simon as he sat, still surrounded, still solemn, still composed. "I've served under decorated officers and brilliant commanders, but I've never met a man who understood quiet excellence the way he does, and this institution owes him more than a thank you." Langston turned toward Melissa Pratt, who approached the stage with a small, velvet-covered box. "This was supposed to be a symbolic gesture," Langston said, "but I've changed my mind. It's real now." He stepped off the stage and crossed the lawn toward Simon. The cadets parted respectfully as he approached. "Sergeant McHale," Langston said, his voice carrying even as he stood directly in front of him, "on behalf of Oakridge Military Institute and the thousands who've walked these halls because of the training you gave, I'd like to formally induct you into the Oakridge Hall of Honor." Simon blinked slowly, but his face didn't change. Not at first. Then he spoke, just one word, quiet as a falling leaf. Langston knelt beside him again, just like earlier. But this time his voice was softer. "Because we failed to honor you sooner." He opened the velvet box. Inside was a medal engraved with the Oakridge crest. Above it, in raised lettering, the words, "Service before recognition." Simon stared at it. He didn't reach for it. His hand trembled slightly in his lap, but his expression didn't falter. Langston removed the medal and gently placed the ribbon over Simon's neck. It settled on his chest like it had always belonged there. Then Langston stood, saluted crisply, and said, "Thank you for building us, even when we forgot who did." The crowd rose. It wasn't slow applause this time. It was thunder, the kind that lifted the hairs on the back of your neck, the kind that didn't care whether your name was on the program or how many zeros were on your donation check. It came from cadets who had felt pain and pride on the obstacle course he created, from teachers who understood what it meant to teach year after year without fanfare, from families who suddenly saw that greatness doesn't always stand behind microphone. Todd Mercer stood too, but he didn't clap right away. His jaw was tight, as if something inside him was rearranging. Then, slowly, even he began to clap. Just once. Then again, and this time it was real. After the ceremony, as the sky shifted from dusk to navy, Simon sat on a wooden bench just off the quad. A breeze moved softly through the trees, and the buzz of cleanup began around him. Folding chairs stacked, cords rolled up, the final echoes of the brass band fading. Langston approached one last time, this time without formality. "May I sit?" Simon nodded, patting the space beside him. For a few moments they didn't speak. Just the breeze, the distant laughter of cadets walking back to the dorms, and the creak of old wood beneath them. "I almost didn't come," Simon said finally. Langston glanced at him. "Why not?" "I didn't think anyone would remember or care." Langston let that hang in the air. Then he said, "Sometimes we forget the people who gave us everything because they never asked for anything." Simon smirked. "We were trained not to." Langston nodded. "And maybe we were trained wrong." Simon chuckled. a dry, rasping sound that still managed to feel alive. "You know," he said, tapping the metal gently against his chest, "I never wanted a ceremony. I just wanted to see if the place still had a heartbeat." Langston smiled. "What do you think?" Simon looked out at the quad, where a group of cadets now stood under the lights of Legacy Hill, one pointing toward the far incline where a new marker had been placed just that afternoon. "Legacy course, designed by Master Sergeant Simon McHale, U.S. Army, read, 'Courage is built, not given.'" "I think it does," Simon said, "and I think it always will." Langston rose, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an envelope. "With all of that invitation," Langston said, "next year's commencement, I want you back. I want you to speak." Simon raised a brow. "You sure about that?" "Have them sure they'll listen." Simon took the envelope and held it in both hands. "Then I'll be there." Langston started to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth, Sergeant?" Simon looked up. "You've never been invisible here. We were just too blind to see you." Simon watched him go, the word sitting with him longer than the ceremony ever could. And when the courtyard finally emptied and the lights began to dim, Simon McHale remained, seated on that bench, not forgotten, not mistaken, but finally seen.